We have to figure out what's going on first.
The icebergs falling off and drought and deaths of thousands of animals.
It is a doomsday scenario that there's absolutely no scientific evidence for.
To push to lower CO2 levels is in fact endangering the planet and life on it much more than any increase in CO2.
From the typical environmentalist perspective, the best environment is nature untouched by human hands. That's not a biblical understanding at all.
It's not enough simply to listen to the propaganda and believe it. We have to actually reason through it.
Coral Ridge Ministries and Answers in Genesis present Global Warming, a scientific and biblical expose of climate change.
Global warming is a popular phenomenon now because of the expressions of disaster that tend to come along with the story. And if you can show a story that has big icebergs falling off and drought and deaths of thousands of animals and so on, well, that's going to get the media's attention and certainly people's attention.
But with all the doomsday scenarios, what do scientists really know about global warming?
The simple answer on what is global warming is to say that the Earth's temperature has risen in the past 150 years. We've been able to measure that with thermometers.
There isn't anybody I know that doesn't agree that we are unusually warm right now.
But that's where the agreement among scientists ends.
Once you understand that the temperature is rising, the question is, well, why? And that is where a number of issues come to bear and opinions, because we cannot know for certain.
At this point, I think the research is too preliminary for us to say definitively what is causing global warming, even though I think it's fairly well established that it's happening.
Many of the measurements we have today with satellite and with surface temperature data on the ocean, these are only 30 years old. Even the measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, direct measurements, only go back to 1958. So that's why it's only been just in the last few years that we've been able to get measurements, direct measurements, that lead us to have more confidence there has been some change in temperature in the atmosphere.
As land use changes, climate changes too. If you build a city, the temperatures tend to go up. And so in a lot of places it looks like we're seeing global warming in the urban areas, and yet in rural areas there's not much at all. So this has been a big problem. But with the satellites measuring temperatures above the Earth's surface, it's really getting an unbiased, unfettered by land use change temperature trend. And now we have about 30 years of data, and it's very interesting and very valuable data.
This layer of atmosphere.
The most widely publicized theory, and the view presented in Al Gore's Oscar-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, is that greenhouse gases are largely to blame for the warming.
Greenhouse gases are gases that absorb energy in a certain part of the spectrum that keeps thermal or heat energy in the atmosphere. I think the simplest way to think about this is that if you were in a desert at night, you find that it gets very cold. If you're in the southeastern United States at night, say Florida or Alabama or somewhere, you'll find that the nighttime temperatures in the summer stay warm. Well, water vapor or humidity in the southeast is a greenhouse gas that keeps the heat in and doesn't allow it to escape at night.
Sunlight comes in, warms the Earth. But what most people don't realize is that for all of that sunlight coming in, there has to be an equal amount of infrared heat energy going back out to outer space. Now the climate modelers claim that there's this fragile balance between the incoming sunlight and the outgoing infrared, and that when we add the CO2, we're upsetting that delicate balance.
CO2, or carbon dioxide, is the greenhouse gas that grabs most of the headlines.
They make it sound like it's that radiation balance that determines what the temperature of the Earth is, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that it's the sunlight coming in that determines how warm things are going to get. Weather creates a greenhouse effect, which is mostly water vapor and clouds, and in other words, the weather has control over the greenhouse effect, and if we add CO2, I think the weather is going to change slightly in order to reduce the warming from that extra CO2.
Some people say that CO2 has a dominant effect on the Earth's climate. And the models tend to make you believe that because they leave out all the other variables that I think really matter.
We have to figure out what's going on first. If it were as simple as excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is we know is real, is causing the Earth to warm up, then the data would support that. It doesn't.
The great question is, how much, if at all, does that account for the warming that we have seen in recent years? And the best scientific evidence that I see indicates that it is a very tiny proportion of the total cause, if in fact it can even be viewed as a part of the cause at all.
The oceans contain much more carbon dioxide than the atmosphere does. And if the temperature, the warming occurs and it warms the ocean, it releases carbon dioxide, very much like a bottle of soda pop. When it's warm, it fizzes very easily. So the ocean will release carbon dioxide when it's warmer. That in turn explains the increase in carbon dioxide with the increase in temperature. But the temperature leads the carbon dioxide change.
We can't look out and develop an instrument that says, this tells me why the temperature is changing. Some people think all that you see in terms of global warming is caused by humans and the greenhouse gases we emit because of energy production. Others say it's completely naturally induced, like changes in the solar input from the sun or various ways in which the weather fluctuates due to natural changes in the ocean circulation or wind systems and so on like that.
The bottom line is that, contrary to popular reports, not all scientists agree that global warming is man-made.
I would say that the mainstream view of global warming is, yes, we are unusually warm right now, and most of it is probably due to mankind. Now, you'll hear that there's a consensus of scientists that believe this. It turns out that there are very few scientists in the world that know enough about the whole problem to actually be able to cast judgment on this. So that if you hear that 1,000 scientists agree that global warming is due to mankind, chances are only 10 of that 1,000 actually know enough about the problem to cast any judgment on the issue at all.
We don't really know for certain what's causing global warming. We know that it's happening. There is evidence to suggest that the Earth's temperature has gone up a bit. And there are many mechanisms that have been proposed. And of course, the one that I'm most interested in as an astronomer would be the astronomical aspects of that, namely the influence of the sun. But we do know that the sun's overall intensity is greater when there are more sunspots. That's something that's been measured. So that's definitive. But we don't know for certain if that's what's causing the increased temperatures on Earth.
Al Gore says in his Inconvenient Truth that there's a consensus, and other scientists in the media say there's a consensus, but they're getting this from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC is the acronym for it. And they claim that there's a consensus of 2,500 scientists that now man is causing most, if not all, the global warming. That's the claimed consensus. But there isn't a consensus because there's a lot of meteorologists and atmospheric scientists and environmentalists that say that we believe that natural processes are a significant part of the global warming.
Aside from the causes of warming, the effects of global warming are also up for debate.
As far as Al Gore's movie goes, An Inconvenient Truth, I think there was a lot of misrepresentation and half-truths in that movie. He showed a lot of dramatic footage of different things going on, ice crashing off of glaciers into the ocean, and droughts and floods, and of course what he didn't mention was everything he showed in the movie happens naturally.
The concern that many scientists have is that whether you have an ice age or whether you have warming, major warming, it's going to cause droughts and doom and gloom. But there are benefits. For example, in the northern parts of the United States and in Canada, if you have global warming, you're going to have longer growing seasons up there, and people will be able to live up there. It will be warmer to the south, and there may be some places of drought, but we have droughts today, so it's not a major effect.
Well, a lot of people, when they hear about global warming, they have this doom and gloom mentality that it's going to just be a disaster and wipe out all life on Earth. And really, we need to consider that actually global warming may have a number of positive benefits as well. And now certainly it'll have some negative consequences, but we need to consider the fact that, for example, human lives will probably be saved as a result of global warming, because after all, more people die of exposure to cold than they do exposure to heat. And therefore increasing Earth's temperatures will likely result in fewer human casualties. Now that's something that people need to consider, as well as certain areas of the world becoming more habitable as a result of global warming. And granted, certain areas becoming less habitable as well. So things are going to change, but not all of it's negative change, and therefore we ought to have a balanced view of global warming and not just to have a reactionary position on it.
You know, in science, as Lord Kelvin said, all science is numbers. And so when I hear people talk about polar bears, I say, well, let's be scientific about them. Let's count the polar bears. And it turns out the polar bear population has grown by a factor of over 3 in the last 40 years.
Some experts say the record-setting 2005 hurricane season is evidence for global warming, but not all agree.
There's a lot of uncertainty about whether hurricanes are either more frequent or more intense. Certainly, 2005 was a record year for hurricane hits in the United States. That was pretty amazing. But then you remember 2006 was a flop, basically. It was below normal. And it turns out that since we only have good hurricane data as far as how many hurricanes are out there in the Atlantic, since we've had weather satellites back in the 1970s, that we really don't know how many there were before then with much confidence.
In the period from about 1970 to about 1995, there was a period of low hurricane frequency, and we kind of got lulled into the idea there wasn't going to be very many hurricanes. Suddenly, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, we got a lot more hurricanes, and they were more intense. Much of the damage, however, that was produced by these wasn't due to more hurricanes and more intense ones. It had to do more with the fact that we had more structures built along coastlines. There was more buildings and more families and more casinos. And when a hurricane hits one of those, it's going to do a lot of damage.
But what about the future? News reports claim global warming is the #1 threat to our future survival as a planet, saying that ice caps could melt, submerging entire cities under the ocean.
For example, on sea level rise, people have, particularly because of Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, they have these pictures in mind of sea level rising 20, 40, 60 feet, something like that. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates sea level rise through the entire 21st century at probably not more than a total of 16 inches in the entire century.
Whether the oceans are going to rise 2.5 feet over the next 100 years, or whether they're going to rise 20 feet, which is the model that Al Gore uses for his Inconvenient Truth, his crockumentary that won an Oscar. It is a doomsday scenario that there's absolutely no scientific evidence for. No reputable scientist is talking about a 20-foot increase in the oceans.
The amount of sea level rise has been downgraded over time. In the 1980s, they were talking about 6 feet of rise by 2100. Then it went down to 2 feet. And the latest 2007 IPCC report only said about 1 foot to maybe 16 inches. And it's interesting that estimated drop in sea level caused a lot of environmentalists to complain to the IPCC to not do that, not de-emphasize the sea level rise.
Some experts say we should take aggressive action to reduce consumption of fossil fuels, not only to protect the environment itself, but also to save people living in poverty. Others say the opposite is true.
We have at least 1 million Africans dying each year because of a lack of access to electricity. We have Africans dying by the hundreds of thousands, mostly children, because we've got poor people burning wood and dung in huts, which cause respiratory illnesses, which kill mostly children. Meanwhile, these people can't have electricity because environmentalists that don't even live in Africa put pressure on their governments and don't let them build hydroelectric dams that could give them electricity and save their lives. So basically, what's happening is we are sacrificing the poor at the altar of radical environmentalism.
Even if scientists don't have all the answers, Christians should be concerned about global warming, but they should also be concerned about their approach to the issue.
I think there's some very significant risks to evangelicals getting involved with this without really knowing the science or the economics well. The first and most important risk, the one that I care about the most, is that they might unwittingly endorse a policy that is very destructive to the poorest people in this world, the most vulnerable people. Those people desperately need abundant and cheap energy to drive the economic development that will lift them out of absolute poverty.
In Genesis chapter 2, Adam was put into the garden to keep it and to till it. To keep it means to guard it and to protect it. To till it means to cause it to bring forth its fruit, to develop it. For what purpose? For human good.
From a biblical standpoint, I think we are called to be good stewards of the environment, right? And that's where Christians, understandably get involved in environmentalism. Of course, what does good stewardship mean? I mean, it's clear that humans come first. But at the same time, we shouldn't be destroying the environment wantonly. So there's a gray area, and people have to decide, how far you go to protect the environment.
I think we need to, in our evangelical Christian churches, do a far better job than we have of helping people to understand what a biblical earth-keeping ethic is, what creation care really means, and what our responsibilities are in terms of creation care. But and part of that being to understand that human beings come first in God's creation, not last, and are not irrelevant, and are not considered the enemies of God's creation.
The amount of global warming so far since 1880, the end of the Little Ice Age, is only 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not a lot to panic over. And I believe a good proportion of that is from natural processes, and it can be demonstrated from the literature.
CO2 is presented as a pollutant because you want to show that it's the byproduct of industry, which is what they're attacking. In fact, there is no life on Earth without CO2 in the atmosphere. Plants need it to produce oxygen, and without that oxygen, there is no living things on the planet. And to push to lower CO2 levels is, in fact, endangering the planet and life on it much more than any increase in CO2.
There is one major benefit, I think, to the increase in carbon dioxide that everybody's concerned about, and that is plants grow much more effectively. They will grow, you can increase the carbon dioxide in greenhouses, and you'll get plants to grow at a rate of 2 and 3 times what they normally do, and they take much less water in order to be able to grow.
In the documentary titled The Great Global Warming Swindle, scientists question today's popular theory on global warming. Dr. Tim Ball, a prominent climatologist from Canada, has received several death threats for speaking out on his views regarding the causes of climate change.
All scientists should be skeptics. All scientists should question anything and challenge all the time. Where it became really personal and nasty was when we were called deniers. And of course, all of the Holocaust connotations of that term, which is really an obscenity. What's amusing about it is we're called climate change deniers, when in fact my whole career has been going around the country saying that climate changes all the time.
Just by saying that I don't think that humans control climate, I am painted into a corner and somehow cast as a demon by one side, and as a hero by the other. And I think I'm not really a hero nor a demon, but I'm just a scientist who studies what he sees and tries to report on it.
The radical environmentalist movement, one of the key problems that they have is, in order to make some of the statements they're saying, they have to basically ignore science. And if you're trying to take care of the Earth, if you're trying to make sure Earth's ecosystems are working correctly and so forth, then in the end you have to look at science. It's our only tool for knowing what's wrong with the Earth, how to fix it, and so forth. Time and time again, though, these radical environmentalists have to actually ignore the science in order to say what they have to say.
If you can persuade people that this great catastrophe is on the horizon, you can promote that agenda. And the easiest way, it seems, to persuade people is not to argue the evidence. From the typical environmentalist perspective, the best environment is nature untouched by human hands. That's not a biblical understanding at all. The Bible says that when God created man, He told him, He gave him a commission to multiply, to fill up the earth, to subdue it, and to rule over it. When He placed him in the Garden of Eden, which was not the entire planet, He told him to cultivate and guard the garden.
And in Romans 1:25, the Apostle Paul warns us against those who have exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator.
One of the things that I see happening with a lot of groups and a lot of people is what we call pantheism, and that's worshiping the creation. You know, one of the terms we have in the Northwest is tree hugger, which is not necessarily a bad term, but I think it represents the fact that often people tend to worship God's creation and not worship the Creator Himself.
I think there's probably something going on with sunlight that we don't understand.
Dr. Roy Spencer, former senior scientist of climate studies at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and principal research scientist at the University of Alabama, suggests solar variability drives climate change.
It only takes a small change in the radiation to do what we're seeing. I mean, we're only talking about 0.2 of a degree C warming every decade, and that's considered a lot of warming. And it turns out that the change in either sunlight or infrared radiation that you need to get that is really tiny.
We know that there are these temperature fluctuations, and we know that these temperature fluctuations, the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, have nothing to do with the increase in carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide didn't start increasing until about 1850. We know that based on statistical correlations of the amount of solar radiation and the sunspot cycle correlated with the temperature cycle since about 1900. For instance, between 1880 and 1910, the temperature just oscillated. It didn't really change a lot. In 1910 to 1940, it went up a lot, and then it peaked. And then it went down from 1940 to about 1975. It actually cooled. And then it's been going up since 1975 to the present day. So when you check the sunspot cycle hit that right on, where it got the warming going to 1910 to 1940, and it caught the cooling trend into the 1970s, and then it's been going up slightly ever since. So it's correlated with that. Well, the carbon dioxide trend was pretty flat, going up only slowly since the Industrial Revolution till after World War II.
We know that sunspots, when there are more sunspots, the solar intensity is greater, and so it's reasonable to conclude that the Earth probably experiences larger temperatures during those time periods. Of course, it's not all that simple, because the Earth has its own system and it's a very complex climate as well. And so just because you turn up the sun's intensity doesn't necessarily mean the Earth's overall temperature will increase as a result of it. But that would be the most natural conclusion.
One of the explanations for global warming is that it's not a long-term trend, but a fluctuation in short term. And in fact, we already know that there are such fluctuations. They're called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. This occurs in the South Pacific, or in the Pacific Ocean, about every 7 to 10 years. We have the La Nina, produces more precipitation and severe weather, particularly along the west coast, but it affects the whole globe. This short-term fluctuation of every 7 to 10 years is just an example of the periodicities that typically occur in climate. There are some that are on the order of 20 to 50 years. There's others on the order of 100 years. There's even some on the order of 1,000 years. We know, for example, if you go back 1,000 years ago, we were in what was called the climactic optimum. That is, it was warm for about 400 years, from 1,000 years ago to about 600 years ago. And then there was a period for about another 300 years in which it was cold, called the Maunder Minimum.
Well, the Maunder Minimum is a period of several decades that was in the late 1600s and just into the very early 1700s, where there were very few spots on the sun. And in fact, there are about 1,000 times fewer spots than there would be in a typical decade today, where we might have several thousand in a decade. There they might have 5. So it's an enormous difference. And it turns out that this corresponds with the peak of what we call the Little Ice Age, a period of decreased temperatures on the Earth that happened at around that time. It actually lasted a bit longer than that, but the peak of that was during the Maunder Minimum. And so it's been suggested, and I think it's a reasonable inference, that perhaps the fewer sunspots, and therefore the sun having a lower intensity overall, has in fact caused the lower temperatures on the Earth. And therefore the fact that we have more sunspots today might be at least partly responsible for why we have increased temperatures today.
One of the really exciting new discoveries, in my opinion, is the effect of changes in sunlight on cosmic rays. It's something that's been studied for less than 10 years. The leader in this is a scientist named Svensmark, who's Danish, and what he found is that when sunlight changes, it really affects the cosmic rays that hit the Earth's atmosphere. When the sun is more intense, the solar wind generated by the sun tends to sweep away cosmic rays, make them less common. The main effect of cosmic rays in the Earth's atmosphere is to create clouds, because cosmic rays actually cause condensation of water. So when there are more cosmic rays, there tend to be more clouds. Fewer cosmic rays are associated with fewer clouds. Now, when the sun is brighter, sweeping away the cosmic rays, it really means less cloud cover. And we can see the cloud cover really matching up nicely and very, very systematically with these changes in sunlight. So what you get when the sun is brighter is you get kind of a double effect, a little bit more radiation, but probably more significantly less cloud cover. And we know that clouds have a huge effect on climate, but it's one that has never really been systematically modeled or simulated in climate models.
The majority of media attention has been focused on the need to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide or CO2, to stop global warming.
One of the big misconceptions about greenhouse gases is that carbon dioxide is the main one, and that's not true. The Earth's natural greenhouse effect is mostly due to water vapor and clouds.
In fact, 95% of greenhouse gases are actually water vapor, and the input of CO2 by humans into the Earth's atmosphere is minuscule.
What tends to happen with the climate models is they hold most things constant. We don't know how the El Nino and La Nina are going to change in the future, so we just kind of leave them out. We don't know about sunspot cycles, long-term and short-term, so we leave that out. And we don't know how things like land use change are going to have an effect, so we leave those out. And what we're left with is really changes in greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide.
The focus is just on CO2, which is a very small part of it, but the sun explains virtually all of the temperature change that we're seeing.
Notice the correlation between solar warming and the Earth's temperature changes over the past century. In spite of these findings, Dr. Ball says that the funding that supports the theory of man-made global warming has created an industry that has generated a truth of its own.
In the U.S., it's $100 billion at last count, federal money going to funding trying to prove the theory. And of course, that's completely against the scientific method, because the scientific method tries to disprove a theory, not prove it. And so you're not only funding only one side of it, but you're also thwarting how science should properly work.
One of my favorite scientists was the late Richard Feynman, who was a premier physicist in the U.S. And Feynman said, "The finest scientists are always trying to prove themselves wrong." What I really see in science is often the reverse of that. People are trying to prove themselves right, and they seem to grasp at things that will prove their point.
The funding for government funding for grants is skewed now towards those who believe that climate change is a problem. After all, why would you fund research for something that's not a problem? And so there has been a war chest built up for those who supposedly represent the consensus view.
Dr. Ken Chilton is an associate professor of environmental economics at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. He warns that if we implement a reduction in oil use, it could cost us dearly in the long run.
What would the gas prices look like if we had to try to reduce oil use, coal use, and our energy use in our house? Coal is the primary source for producing electricity in this country. Well, it would impoverish even a rich country like the United States. The rich countries of the world would not be able to help the developing countries because we would become like the developing countries.
The suggestion has been made that we need to reduce carbon dioxide input to the atmosphere below what we had back in 1990, even cutting it maybe by 50% below that. To do that would take a major percentage of the economy out of our culture. We could spend 50% of our annual product, economic product, to be able to make that kind of an effect. That is a major commitment to do that. But probably more important is, would it do any good? And I'm convinced that it wouldn't. For one thing, is I don't think the carbon dioxide increase that we have measured is producing that big an effect. I think the primary increase is due to something different, the variation in the electromagnetic fields on the sun. And for us to spend a major percentage of our economy to try to reduce carbon dioxide when it's probably not the main cause and probably wouldn't have a major effect, I think would be a major mistake.
People that have a political agenda see it as a very nice vehicle to push their own agenda. It's logical to want to be a good citizen of Earth. We are citizens of Earth. But you don't do it when you're being pressured by fear and also when you're being exploited because of your lack of understanding.
One of the justifications for doing something about global warming is it will help the poor, because the poor supposedly are at the greatest risk from global warming. The truth is what the poor are at risk of is dying from poverty and disease. It's a result of poverty. And so what we need, they need to use more energy and of course have the freedom to have free markets and all that to get themselves out of poverty.
According to poverty.org, hunger alone kills over 9 million people each year.
One of the unintended consequences of trying to do an all-out war on global warming is that it is going to cause the developing countries not to be able to develop as they need. They are in poverty at this point, and one of the best chances they have for being able to get out of poverty is to be able to have the technology applied to agriculture and to be able to get power, to be able to put in technology into small villages and so on. If, in fact, we enforce the same criteria that we're trying to enforce upon ourselves and developed countries, it's going to stop the developing countries from growing at all. And that is really a major catastrophe, I think, for these poor developing countries.
If, then, we're going to reduce CO2 emissions significantly in an attempt to fight global warming, we're going to have to greatly increase the costs of fossil fuels, which in turn will diminish economic production and particularly diminish the rate of economic development, especially in poor countries. The result of that is going to be that we condemn people in poor countries, the roughly 2 billion of the people in this world who live right now without electricity to their homes, without pure drinking water or sewage sanitation. We will condemn them to decades or generations more of the great poverty in which they live and the disease, the high death rates that they suffer right now because of that.
Poor people actually do the most environmental harm. Why? Because it's about survival. If I have to go cut down a tree in order to have firewood, and I have to have firewood to burn in my little house to make food, then I'm going to do that. If I'm poor, I have to. I have no choice. But if you're wealthy enough, you've got more alternatives, more ways to address a problem. If you're poor, you're just going to wind up being victimized by things like hurricanes, by floods, by ice storms.
Believers should understand the great blessings that we have achieved through these past few thousand years, and that gives us the ability to enhance human life, which I think is a command in Scripture.
In Matthew 25:40, the Scripture says, "The king will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Many evangelical Christians have recently become concerned with environmental issues because of a proper desire to be good stewards of God's creation. But does the modern environmental movement uphold a biblical view of the environment?
It's pretty clear in the Bible that the earth is the Lord's and that human beings are put in charge as God's vicars, as His vice regents. And we are to be there seeking to exercise stewardship responsibility. That means to use the earth and its resources in renewable ways that benefit human beings without desecrating.
Dr. Richard Land is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention.
In Genesis chapter 2, Adam was put into the garden to keep it and to till it. To keep it means to guard it and to protect it. To till it means to cause it to bring forth its fruit, to develop it. For what purpose? For human good. And in Genesis chapter 1, the Bible tells us that we are given dominion. And the word dominion there is a strong word. Dominion over the earth.
Indeed, in Genesis 1:26 we read, "Then God said, Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Yet the modern environmental movement often seems to be driven by a much different view.
They tend to look upon human beings as the enemy of nature. E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, in his new book, talks about human beings as an alien species, and human beings as an alien species having a negative impact on nature. I'm sorry. Human beings are not an alien species to nature as created by God.
If you truly believe that everything we see around us is the result of evolution, then you believe random chance is the main architect. It's been guided by natural selection, but the architect itself is random chance. Well, random chance is a terrible designer of things. So you would expect anything that random chance is able to cobble together is going to be incredibly fragile and not work very well. So if you believe that, you will probably believe then that the Earth's ecosystems are incredibly fragile and have to be worried over every second of every day. If you believe instead that this is all the result of a very powerful, very intelligent designer, you figure the designer has put in feedback mechanisms and fail-safes to keep the Earth robust as it changes over the course of time. So under that scenario, you wouldn't be so worried about the fragileness of Earth. You'd want to protect Earth and take care of Earth the way you take care of any fine gift you're given. But in the end, you wouldn't think of it as fragile. You'd think of it as something that's robust that I simply need to be a steward of.
God gave us this earth in which we live as a resource, which doesn't mean that we should abuse it. We need to be very careful how we use it, but we are to use it. There are some who would take an extreme position and say that we shouldn't use this world, this atmosphere, the climate, soils, forests, or anything, that it should be left pristine. That's not the case. But we need to be very careful as stewards that we don't abuse it.
I've often talked to environmentalists who truly have the view that humans are bad for the planet. We really shouldn't be on the planet would be better off without humans. And so it fits their view of what can we do to cease development, to help human life expand. They see those as bad things. I think the number one thing evangelical Christians should remember is what is at the peak of the pyramid in terms of creation. And if you read Genesis especially, you'll see that human life is at the peak of the pyramid. And it is human life that has the greatest value in terms of what you see in creation. And therefore, what you do to preserve, protect, grant security and health to in terms of human life is the number one thing you can do.
People live longer and live healthier in developed countries. So if we delay Africa even by 10 years in their development, in the end, that's going to be 10 years of bodies we leave behind. And that has to be figured into any proposal. How many bodies is it going to pile up in order for this proposal to come to fruition?
Experts point out that well-meaning Christians should be very careful when advocating environmental policies, even with the best of intentions.
Science lives with uncertainty. Policy and politics don't have that. Policy and politics are black and white. They're yes or no. Do we pass the bill or do we not? Do we vote aye or nay? And so that's what policymakers have to do based on the input from scientists. As I see it, some scientists have fallen in the trap of treating climate change as a black and white issue, and it isn't.
Unfortunately, what looks and appears good oftentimes to policymakers has unintended consequences that are quite tragic. A good example, the whole environmental movement kicked off, for us anyway, in the Western world, with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring.
Carson's 1962 book claimed that the pesticide DDT caused cancer and threatened certain bird species. But DDT had also been extraordinarily successful in combating malaria-carrying mosquitoes, with the World Health Organization estimating it saved 500 million lives.
What happens with DDT sprayed in a home or a hut in Africa is the mosquitoes typically don't even want to enter the house. If they land on the wall of the house, they are going to die. But generally, it just wards them off. And it has protection for almost 6 months. Very inexpensive.
In the years following World War II, malaria was nearly eradicated in countries where DDT was used. But Carson's book ultimately spawned a worldwide moratorium on the pesticide. More than 4 decades later, most of her claims about DDT have been disproved. Yet malaria, spread by mosquitoes, is again one of the leading causes of death in underdeveloped countries, killing more than 1 million people a year.
There does tend to be a habit for the media to use sensational, and I think a lot of scientists have gotten caught up in that. They will proclaim things that prove a point that tend to be spectacular, and often the doomsayers are the ones that get the most attention. So when doomsaying turns out not to be true, you seldom do get the retractions. You don't get the people saying, sorry, we were wrong. They just kind of move on to a different topic.
The unintended consequence? A huge rise in malarial deaths and malarial cases, again, in the parts of the world that are the poorest, in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. I think we can safely say they were in the tens of millions. That's a lot of humanity. Yeah, Christians should care about the environment just because we care about the Creator. But we do have to be careful.
Many experts say the best thing we can do for the environment, while also benefiting marginalized peoples, is encourage economic growth.
Environmental protection is better done in wealthier societies than it is in poorer societies, which is why the greatest environmental disasters are all occurring in the poorest places in the world, not in the wealthiest places. If we want to protect the environment, we really need to promote the economic development of the poor.
But much of the modern environmental movement is opposed to this solution, as seen in the global warming controversy.
I've studied the environment for probably 20 years. I've studied climate change for 15, and they're not easy topics. They've always got a hidden, unintended consequence to them, generally, that people don't think about.
There are some environmentalists who are just basically anti-capitalism, anti-political freedom, anti-wealth, anti-industrialization, and they see the promotion of fears about global warming as a way to serve their own agenda. Because if we can convince people that we must make drastic cuts in CO2 emissions, Well, the only way to do that is to greatly reduce our use of fossil fuels.
You often hear people saying, even if we don't know that carbon dioxide buildup is causing global warming, we need to do something to stop it, just in case that's what could be caused in 50 or 100 years. The problem with that attitude is, if I do something to try and reduce global carbon dioxide levels now, people will die as a result. For example, if the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol, which is supposed to help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then in the end, our cost of heating oil would go up. As heating oil costs go up, poor people tend to turn off the heat in the winter. And every year, poor people, especially poor elderly people, die because they can't afford to heat their homes. Now, is it really worth sacrificing these people for something we don't even know is real?
The question is whether or not evangelicals allow themselves to be manipulated, allow themselves to be duped. And what we are to do is to judge everything by the plumb line of the Word of God. And the Word of God, in the first 9 chapters of Genesis, gives us the foundational planks of a biblical environmental ethic. And if you look at those, you will find that they're considerably at odds with the modern radical environmentalist movement.
The Bible tells us that we have to reason. Come, let us reason together, says the Lord. So it's a Christian's responsibility to reason through these things. It's not enough simply to listen to the propaganda and believe it. We have to actually reason through it. I think that's actually a scriptural imperative for us to be thoughtful about these kinds of things. So regardless of whether it's real or not, we have to at least first reason through it to decide. And I think if we reason through it, we will come up, we will see some of these unintended consequences, and we can come up with ways of fixing those.
I think Christians should apply 1 Thessalonians 5:21, which says, examine everything carefully, but hold fast to that which is good. And that's been my research principle for 40 years. I believe in holding fast to that which is good, to the Bible as God's Word, to Jesus as my Lord and Savior. But then I examine everything carefully. I don't think Jesus meant us to just accept everything and that the world has out there, from the environmental movement to a lot of different controversial issues, but we're to examine everything carefully. So based on that, I believe Christians should look at the data and examine this issue at more than the superficial level.
I think one of the main things as Christians, we need to not buy into a viewpoint just because of the intensity of the argument.
I think that Christians need to have a balanced view of global warming. On the one hand, it's something that we should be interested in, something that we should be concerned about, but not overly worried about, because God has given us dominion over this earth. We're to be good stewards of it, and therefore we're to care for it. And that involves researching things to make sure that they're not going to be a problem. But at the same time, we know that God takes care of the earth as well, and it's something that it's self-maintaining to some extent, and it's not something that we should sort of jump on the bandwagon of all the people that are, have a lot of hype about this issue. I think we need to have a balanced approach as Christians.